Good evening. You want to turn to Isaiah. We're going to be working our way through this book pretty quick tonight. There's a lot of information here, a lot of details I won't be able to touch on, but my goal is to have you walk away feeling somewhat comfortable and knowing what this book is about. We studied through both 1st and 2nd Kings, and one of the things I mentioned in 2nd Kings is that these books have supplements. These books have additional books that shed some light on other things that are going on during the reigns of these kings. And these supplemental books are called the prophets. Tonight we're going to look at the book of Isaiah. He's one of the prophets. And what we see in Isaiah is one of the most comprehensive and in-depth revelations of what God was thinking and what God's people were doing and what God had planned for His people, all given to us in 66 chapters. If you wanted to try to negotiate or navigate Isaiah in your mind, it's pretty simple, and the easiest way to remember it is there are 39 books in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. The first 39 books, chapters of Isaiah, is the first major section that talks about trusting in the Lord. And then the last 27 chapters are really much more New Testament kind of focused chapters about the Messiah and the revelation of God's work to bring about the salvation of His people. So Isaiah is one of those books that, from a big picture perspective, understanding the book as a whole, it's really easy because it matches well with the Old and the New Testaments. 39 chapters, 27 chapters, if you were to break this book up. But if you're going to get into more detail, as we like to do as we study these books, I try to give you a little bit more detail so that you can work your way through the book and know what this whole section's about as you study into the details of it. You see that there's a lot more to it than that. In fact, there's a whole lot to the book of Isaiah that I could easily spend hours talking to you about. And it's endlessly deep. It's hard to fit all this stuff in my mind as I'm studying through this book. But I really want to just give you the main point and what all of this is about, why God has revealed all these things to His prophet Isaiah. So we're going to start off in Isaiah chapter 1, and you'll see right there at the very beginning kind of an understanding of why this whole book has been given to us, okay? So Isaiah 1, if you're there with me, verse 1, it says, "The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah." Now this is telling us who he is, the reigns of the kings. There's 4 different kings that are reigning, and they reigned over a long period of time. Uzziah, Jotham, and Hezekiah are good kings. Ahaz is a really bad king, so sacrificed his own children to foreign gods. Just a horrible king. And Isaiah is prophesying all during their reigns. Okay, verse 2. "Hear, O heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord has spoken. Children have I reared and brought up, but they have rebelled against me. The ox knows its owner, and the donkey its master's crib. But Israel does not know. My people do not understand. Ah, sinful nation, a people laden with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, children who deal corruptly. They have forsaken the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They are utterly estranged. Why will you be struck down? Why will you continue to rebel? The whole head is sick, and the whole heart is faint. From the sole of the foot even to the head, there is no soundness in it, but bruises and sores and raw wounds. They are not pressed out or bound up or softened with oil." And he just goes on and on about that. But you see in this, he starts to give at the very beginning of this book the current condition in Israel. And this is kind of a surprising condition because the kings, Uzziah, Jotham, and Hezekiah are good kings, and Ahaz is a bad king. But you got 3 out of 4, right? Surely Israel's doing really good. But what God says through Isaiah is Israel's not doing good at all. Israel's doing really bad. They don't know God. And notice the way he says it, that they have their whole head is sick and their whole heart is faint. There's something majorly wrong with Israel and the way that it's operating, the way that it's working. The hearts and the minds of the people are not devoted to God. And so now we have the book of Isaiah, which is going to be intended to help the people understand who God is. Really, as I say this is a comprehensive book, what I mean is this is a book that really tells you who God is. You learn a lot about God throughout this book as he reveals himself through this prophet. In the rest of this little section, in chapters 1 through 6, you just kind of have a setup for the whole book, kind of relaying all the conditions of Israel. You have a listing of different sins that they have, of idolatry and forsaking God and pursuing other things and lawlessness and evil and all kinds of things like that. And in the midst of this section, you have plans from God to rebuild and plans from God to destroy. And this is seen throughout the book. There's kind of this back and forth nature in some of the chapters where he talks about the judgments that will be due because of their sins, and he talks about his plans to restore and redeem. Very much like we saw and we've been seeing in Jeremiah. That's what we see in this. In chapter 2, verse 1, these are the words of Isaiah, the son of Amos, concerning Judah and Jerusalem. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations. He shall decide disputes for many peoples. They shall beat their swords and the plowshares, their spears and the pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord. Here you see one of the messianic pictures in this first little section, the first 6 chapters, that one day all the nations will flow to Zion and to Jerusalem, Zion, and they will go there to learn about the Lord. Nobody right now knows the Lord, but you see God is going to be working in all these things that he's going to be revealing throughout this book to bring about a situation where everybody is coming to learn about the Lord and to know more about who he is. So in the rest of this section, he talks about why they're rejected. He talks about how they're also going to be taken off into exile. This is something that is mentioned pretty much at the beginning of this book in chapter 5 and verse 13. Therefore my people will go into exile for lack of knowledge. Notice that idea is still seen even there. So from the very beginning, setting the stage for the whole book, you get the condition of Israel, that they don't know God, and that God has this plan to fix this problem, so much so that not only will Israel know God, but all the nations will be coming to Israel, to Zion, to learn about who God is. So that's essentially the book of Isaiah in short form. But as you continue through, you see a lot more detail, a lot more information. In chapter 6, as Keith read, we have the call of Isaiah. And he is brought before the throne scene of God, as he mentioned. This is a beautiful, interesting scene. And he has the humility to recognize he is not worthy to be before the throne of God. But God has this mercy and compassion to heal him of his uncleanness, make him clean. And then he volunteers to go out and preach this news. And the message God tells him to preach is, keep on hearing and don't understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the heart of this people dull and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. You kind of see in the message that God is just gonna allow Isaiah to go and preach, and he knows it's going to be completely fruitless. They're not going to listen to anything he says, and eventually they're going to be laid waste. And at the end of chapter 13, verse 13 of chapter 6, it says, though a tenth remain in it, it will be burned again like a terebinth or an oak, whose stump remains when it is felled. The holy seed is its stump. He essentially says, we're going to burn it all down, so that the only thing that's left is this little stump, and that little stump is going to be the holy seed. And that's actually a picture he uses later to say a shoot comes up from the stump of Jesse. But you kind of get this little bit of hope. Even though there's hopelessness in the fact that Israel doesn't know God, there is a little bit of hope that after God completely destroys Jerusalem and all of Israel, that there will be a holy seed, that from it will come the promises that God is hoping to bring. Okay, so that kind of encapsulates the message of the book, and we'll bring that up again at the end. Then we get into the next kind of section of the book. In chapter 7, we see a little bit of a narrative as Isaiah comes before King Ahaz. Remember, Ahaz is the bad king of the kings that Isaiah is prophesying during the reign of. Well, Ahaz has the king of Syria, not Assyria, but Syria, and the king of Ephraim, the northern tribes of Israel, coming up against him, and he is terrified because these guys are coming up against him. He thinks he's about to be destroyed. And Isaiah comes to Ahaz, the wicked king, and says to Ahaz, don't be afraid. God is going to deliver you and going to keep you from dying in this situation, from suffering in this situation. He's going to protect you. Ask God to give you a sign, and God will perform it for you to let you know that he will surely do this. And Ahaz says, I will not test the Lord. Ahaz is this wicked king. Instead of being obedient and listening and doing what God asks, he refuses. But even though Ahaz is a bad king, we see God fulfilling this promise and protecting the southern kingdom of Judah from the attack of Syria and the attack of Israel, and causing Israel, the northern kingdom, to end up being destroyed, and Syria as well, at the hands of Assyria. Well, as you go through this section, what you see is God making promises not just for Judah, that he would save them from Syria and Ephraim, but also making promises that he would be with his people. This is something that he says in this. A child will be born, and his name will be Emmanuel. God is with us. Trying to reassure and comfort the people that he is with them and going to help them. Well, that eventually transitions into chapter 9, where he goes through detail of describing how he's going to bring about another king who is going to be righteous, who will be God. He actually says in verse 6 of chapter 9, his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. He promises that they're going to have this better king when this Messiah comes. So there's a promise here even beyond the salvation that's immediate, that there's another Messiah, that there's another salvation coming, a bigger salvation coming. And then you continue and you see more promises from God. This is just full of all kinds of encouragements. God tells his people that he will judge all those who are oppressive, who are full of iniquity. He says he will judge Ephraim. He will judge Syria. He will even judge Assyria after Assyria comes up against his people and destroy them for their pride. And then you get to chapter 10, verse 20. And you see him making promises that he will preserve a remnant from all this judgment that he's about to do on his own people. And he will delight in them. And all those who fear the Lord will be saved through the shoot of Jesse that comes up, right? That righteous branch will eventually save his people. So in chapters 7 through 12, there's just a ton of encouraging signs that God will take care of his people. He will provide for his people. They don't need to be afraid. He's working. He's bringing about an ultimate salvation in the time to come. Well, in chapter 13, all the way through chapter 35, we have this huge section of the book, okay, that details all kinds of judgments. You have in chapters 13 through 24 a description of judgments against all of these different nations: Babylon, Assyria, Philistia, Moab, Syria, Egypt, Tyre and Sidon, Jerusalem, Edom, Arabia. All of those cities are going to be destroyed for all of the iniquity that they have committed against God and rebelling against God and oppressing God's people and trying to take away God's land from his people. So God is bringing about all this judgment, and in chapter 24 it kind of gets to this peak where he says the whole earth will be destroyed, and he even brings up Noah and saying he's going to just destroy and destroy and destroy and just lay waste to all of these different cities and all of these different countries. And you just kind of look at that and you're like, wait a second, is he talking about the end of time judgment, right? That's just what people would point to. But really, as you look at it in context, he's just making this point. I'm going to use the Babylonians to destroy everybody, and then I'm going to destroy them. And then I'm going to destroy everybody else that I didn't destroy through the Babylonians. I'm just going to destroy and destroy and destroy so that the earth will know and understand some things. And so we might wonder, why would God do all this? Why would he bring about all this judgment? Well, in chapter 25, he explains why he's bringing about all of these judgments. First of all, in verses 6 through 9, we see him bring up this mountain again. Remember, he said he was going to make the mountain of Zion the highest mountain. Well, look at verse 6. It says, "On this mountain the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wine, a feast full, rich food and full of marrow, of aged wine well refined. And he will swallow up on this mountain the covering that is cast over all peoples, the veil that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. And the Lord will wipe away tears from all faces, and the reproach of his people he will take away from all the earth, for the Lord has spoken." You see, God lifts up his people in bringing about all of this conquering. He's not going to destroy Jerusalem and create a big hole where all this wickedness rises up and everybody thinks, oh, well, God doesn't care and God's not in control, and look at all these evil, wicked people. No, God's going to destroy them as well. And then in the end, he's going to lift up Zion again and lift up his people so that they can feast and enjoy and rejoice. It's kind of this beautiful picture. And he's going to conquer, notice that, he will swallow up death forever. A promise in the midst of this to swallow up death. But the judgments, not only are they in order to kind of level the playing field, all the wicked people will be judged. They're also an attempt by God to help the people learn righteousness. Look at chapter 26, verse 8. He says, "In the paths of your judgments, O Lord, we wait for you. Your name and remembrance are the desire of our soul. My soul yearns for you in the night. My spirit within me earnestly seeks you. For when your judgments are in the earth, the inhabitants of the world learn righteousness." You see how there's this plea, it seems, from the person who is suffering, recognizing that he is now longing for the Lord in all of his suffering, and that he understands these judgments are so that the world will learn and understand that God desires righteousness. He desires justice. He desires equity. He desires compassion and love, not oppression and iniquity and sin. So all these judgments are really essentially God trying to refine the people of the earth, especially his people, and trying to purge out those evil people so that a remnant of God can glorify God in the earth once again. We see that kind of repeated in chapter 27. And then we get to chapter 28 through 35, a huge section. And what we see here is 6 times where God says, ah, A-H, ah. And in other translations, it says, woe to those. And it kind of lists different sins. It talks about the pride of Ephraim. It talks about the fake religion of Judah. And so, saying, woe to these people who are doing all of these different kinds of evil things. And he goes through and lists a number of them. He says some are turning things upside down, making what is good evil, what is evil good. They're making themselves to be gods. They're acting as though they are the potter and God is the clay, right? They're molding God to make him what they want him to be. And so God brings judgment against them for that. He condemns people for being stubborn and conspiring against the Lord. And then he condemns those who might turn to Egypt seeking after help instead of turning to the Lord and trusting in God. Now, this is an interesting statement that he would make, that they are not relying on God. God says, woe to them, or why are you doing that? Why are you returning to those who cannot help you? So all of these different woes and all of these different ahs are showing God's dissatisfaction with the people, that they have rebelled against him and that God is going to bring about judgment. With all of those woes and with all those ahs, you have mixed in messianic information. He says, why are you doing this? And then he says, this is what I'm going to do. Why are you doing this? This is what I'm going to do. And it kind of culminates and just grows. And then in chapter 35, there's this big chapter full of God's plans to bring about a highway that will be called the way of righteousness. And it says in verse 8, the unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk on the way. And now I love this. Even if they are fools, they shall not go astray. So he's condemning, he's judging, but he's got all these plans to bring about righteousness, to bring about redemption, to bring about salvation, to bring about fruitfulness and his glory in all the earth. And this is really what God is all about. And he describes that to us in this huge section that's full of judgment. We also see a description of how God is going to make things the way they ought to be. Well, that gets us to the last part of this huge section. Remember, 1 through 39 is kind of this big section. In chapters 36 through 39, we have Hezekiah reigning. Remember, we had Ahaz back in chapter 7. Now we get to Hezekiah. Hezekiah is a good king. And what we read about Hezekiah is that Hezekiah trusts in God, and you remember that from 2 Kings, like no one ever before him and like no one ever after him. His trust in God is so extreme that he seems foolish. Here he's got this king of Assyria, the largest nation in the earth. And his father paid tribute to them and just kind of gave in and let them do what they wanted to do. And Hezekiah says, I'm not paying tribute to you. And he rebels against them, and he trusts in the Lord. And then we see the king of Assyria sending his messengers, trying to taunt and trying to ridicule and trying to threaten Hezekiah. And Hezekiah turns to the Lord. And what happens is, because he turns to the Lord and he puts his trust in God instead of just giving in to Assyria, God fights for him. And God wipes out 185,000 soldiers in one night, completely protecting Judah because they put their trust in the Lord. So Hezekiah then stands opposed to Ahaz, who doesn't really trust in the Lord, and God kind of blesses him as well. Hezekiah puts his trust, it seems, fully in the Lord, and he is saved. And now we might draw a conclusion here about why all of this has been structured in this way. Why is there Ahaz and then a ton of judgments and then Hezekiah? I think that's all because you're supposed to learn from those judgments in chapters 13 through 35. You can trust that God will conquer your enemies because he has all this rule. He has all this authority. He has this ability to conquer all these nations. And he has complete control over all these things. And here we see Hezekiah saying, okay, you say you can do all these things. Well, I'm going to trust you to do this against Assyria. And guess what? God says, yeah, I'm going to. And he does it. in one of the most miraculous ways that we see. I mean, this is different than like any event that we see throughout Scripture in this complete slaughter of 185,000 without the king or any of Israel lifting a single finger. God does this for Hezekiah, showing that you can trust in God and he is able to deliver you. In chapter 38, we see Hezekiah get sick, and once again he turns to the Lord, and God heals him of his sickness. And then in chapter 39, we see Hezekiah showing off all his riches to the king of Babylon, showing he's not infallible, he's not this perfect king or anything like that. He makes this mistake, and then God is going to bring about judgment because he has this pride, it seems, in what he maybe has accomplished. We have to read between the lines there about what's going on, but he's obviously showing them everything in some sense of pride and maybe some arrogance. So that kind of concludes this huge section that's full of judgment and explanation about the judgment and the desire from God that his people would be saved and that they would trust in him. Chapter 40 begins, the new section, and listen to the first words. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned, that she has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Now we see the beginning of a section that is all about comfort. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. Comfort them. He's just told them a lot of bad news about the fact that they're going to be going into exile. Now, this is 100 years before that exile will happen. Okay, they've got, under Hezekiah, they've got peace, they've got prosperity. Things seem to be going great, right? Hezekiah's showing off all this stuff. Everything seems to be going well for them. And so God has told them, you're going to go into exile. And now God tells Isaiah, comfort my people. Because of the things that are about to take place, I want you to comfort them and let them know the warfare is going to be over, their iniquity is going to be pardoned. Everything is going to end up in the end working out for their benefit. In the rest of chapter 40, he basically comforts the people by describing God to them. Remember at the first, we said their problem is they don't know the Lord. Well, in chapter 40, he goes to great detail, saying, behold, your God, and just kind of going through in detail who God is and describing God to them. And at the very end, he says in verse 31, they who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. He begins now a section of don't be afraid of what is to come and what is happening in your life. Those who wait on the Lord to deliver you from all this suffering and all this judgment will find strength and find renewal. So don't fear. Don't fear anybody who might come up against you because God has great plans for his people. And then in the second half of chapter 41, all the way through chapter 48, he talks about God and he compares God with different idols in order to kind of inform the people, this is a God who is living and active, a God who is able to conquer all these little gods that people are making, even the great gods of Babylon. And this is a God who's able to set his people free from exile, to forgive them of their sins and to restore them in the land. And he foretells how he's going to do all that, even mentioning Cyrus, the man who will bring them out of exile by name. And then he tells them about idols and tries to explain to them those idols are just useless. And all of that's going to be made known to you throughout this period of exile. You're going to learn and understand the uselessness of your idols. But also in this section, what we see brought up is that God's servant would pop up. Not only is Israel God's servant, but there is another man, a Messiah figure, who will be God's servant, who will deliver God's people. And in chapter 49 through chapter 55, there's a lot of information given about this servant coming and bringing all of those who are humble in the nations to Zion. It's kind of this going on and on about the Messiah and all that he's going to do for God's people. It's just a section full of encouragement. But the interesting thing, you remember chapter 53 is in this section, is that this is a servant who is a king. And it's like those things don't seem to go right together. And so as you go through this, what you notice is there's something odd that's happening in all of this. That here is God's servant. Remember, Moses is called the servant of the Lord. David is called the servant of the Lord. But here's another servant that's popping up. And this servant is going to suffer to a greater extreme than any of the others. And because he's going to go through all of that, he's going to bring about the ultimate salvation and the acceptance of all those who come to him. Remember chapter 55 that I've kind of harped on a lot throughout my time here. He's going to offer the rich food for everybody who will just come to him. They don't need to pay for it. It will be readily available. And then we get into chapter 56. Ooh, we're moving. Chapter 56, he describes the humble being made righteous. In 56 through 59, really 56 through 66 is kind of a section of this, but 56 through 59 talks about how the foreigner or the eunuch will be saved. He is not, the outcast will be brought in, and all those who are stubbornly rebellious will be judged. He's going to save the humble. He's going to save those who have a contrite heart, those who are poor in spirit. Sounds a lot like the Sermon on the Mount and the things that Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. But he's also going to judge all those who are rebellious and stubborn. And then in chapters 58 and 59, he says, I'm going to judge all the religious people who are doing all this fake religion and acting like they're humble before me, but they're really not. And I'm going to save all those who truly fear me. And so he promises that. And then you go to chapters 60 and 62, and you see all those who are humble and who are forgiven, who fear the Lord. Look at verse 1 of chapter 60. Arise and shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you. For behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples. But the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you. And nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising. A picture of Jesus coming, the light rising, and for all of us to then arise and shine and show everybody the glory of the Lord. As God's whole mission is that his glory might be seen in all the earth. In chapters 63 through 66, we have pretty much the ending of the book. Where he talks about pretty much all these different concepts that he's been mentioning throughout the whole book. There's a judgment that is coming for all those who are proud, all those who are rebellious and stubborn. God is going to judge. And then you have kind of a picture of people praying for mercy. And so there's kind of an example here of people prostrating themselves and humbling themselves before the Lord. And because of that, they are called his servants. And all those who are evil, he will curse. But all those who are his servants, he will end up blessing in chapters 65 through 66. He kind of goes through and describes all the curses and all the blessings to all the different people. Those who are proud, he will judge. Those who are humble, he will pardon, and he will forgive, and he will fill, and he will give everything that he has promised them. And then at the very end, we see a promise to gather all the nations to himself and to bring about the new heavens and the new earth where all these nations who have humbled themselves will live with God for all eternity. And also those who continually rebel will end up at the very last of chapter 66. Their worm shall not die, their fire shall not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. So kind of at the very end, you have this statement that God's preparing a new heavens and a new earth for all those who truly love him, and those who seek him, and those who humble themselves. And for those who continually rebel and refuse to submit to God, he is preparing for them eternal torment. And that's kind of the way this entire book ends. Okay, so what do we get out of this book? Well, obviously, I kind of pointed to the message earlier, but the message is God is working to help his people understand their sin, to help his people turn to him, and to help his people learn righteousness and learn about who he is. Right? They don't understand who God is. And so God revealed all this to them to help them understand they are horribly sinful people, and God is this wonderfully righteous God who loves them and cares for them and is going to make a way for them to be forgiven of their sins. But that they need to learn from all these judgments on the earth, all of this that he's about to do in Israel and in all the nations around. They need to learn from that God is not going to tolerate the wickedness and the rebellion that he sees on the earth. And really, it's a picture that he is working, he is molding Israel and all of these events that are about to take place. You see him kind of describing himself, and he does this in chapter 64, even describes himself as kind of this potter who is working with the clay in all of these events that are transpiring and all of these plans that he has for him. He's working with the clay to produce and create something that is going to bring him glory, even though they're just dirt. He's working in them to create something much better. And they need to come to this realization that they are the clay, he is the potter, and submit to his rule and his authority. If we're going to apply this book, hopefully we understand that as God's people, we must come to know the Lord. This is why we're here, to become like him, to be righteous, to be just, to shine as lights for his glory. And so if we decide to stop studying, if we decide to stop learning about who God is, if we completely ignore the book of Isaiah all the days of our lives because, hey, we got better things to do, like watching TV. And we ignore all these prophets that reveal so much to us about who God is, or because it's just really hard and we can't understand it, even though we've been doing that on Sunday mornings. If we're unwilling to take the time to learn about who God is, then we will find in ourselves what we see in Israel and Judah: rebellion and stubbornness. This is at the heart of the problem of all these people. Their heart is sick. Their head is their heart is faint. Their head is sick. They don't understand who God is. They don't understand God's laws and God's ways. And God sent Jesus to earth to help us understand those things. But he also gave us his word to shine a light into who Jesus really is and who God is, in order that we might become like him and learn these things. Throughout this book, we see that God is steadfast in his love for Israel, even though he knows he's about to send them into exile. We talk about that in the Jeremiah class. Punishing them does not show he hates them, even though he says he hates them. Punishing them shows that he actually loves them, and he wants to turn them around to help them become what they should be, what they promised they would be. And then we see, and we understand this about God, that he wants to comfort all those who are suffering, right? This whole last section, I kind of went through really fast. Man, there's so much comfort in those sections. And you're probably like, man, you just missed all these favorite texts of mine. I know I did. There's so much in that section that I didn't know what to pick and choose. So I just kind of had to take the high level throughout all of it. But he wants to comfort all of those who are his children, who are suffering in this life at the hands of those who are wicked. And he wants them to not be afraid. Even though nations crumble, he doesn't want them to be afraid. He wants them to wait on the Lord's deliverance and to trust in him and to maintain holiness and righteousness and humility, because God is seeking to save all those who are humble and all those who wait for him to deliver. This is what we must do. We must understand all of these things and remain faithful and true to God, even in the midst of difficult, impossible, it seems, times, knowing that God is truly faithful and that he does have plans to redeem and to save all Israel after this exile is over. We know that God is still true, God is still faithful, and that he will redeem and bring us up into that new heavens and earth, that new Jerusalem, that new life where we live with him for all eternity, where we never grow old, where there's no more tears, where there's no more suffering. We know God says he will do it. He will do it, because all the things he prophesies in this book take place. God can do exactly what he says he will do. And what he says for us provides us great hope and encouragement to remain faithful, to grow in righteousness, to remain humble. The more we know about God and the more we understand about ourselves, the more humble we ought to become. And the more submissive we ought to try to be to all the will of God. And all that he's done for us deserves all the glory and praise we can muster. If you're here tonight and you understand all these things, I hope that this lesson has been helpful to you. I hope that if you're struggling with all the suffering and all the things that are going on, the turmoil in this world, that you find in these words some comfort that God is still in control. He still loves you, and he has everything in the palm of his hands. And in all of these things that might happen in the future, God is able to bring about some good. He's able to refine. He's able to mold and make us into what we ought to truly be. If you're here and you have not put your trust in the Lord, we want to encourage you and help you in any way we can. If you'll please let us know what you need. Please don't hesitate. Please come forward as we stand and as we sing.